Opening. The gloom of Rowan's reach. The fading light of dusk bled across the horizon, seeping into the overgrown lawn of the Rowan estate like ink soaking through paper. The once proud Victorian mansion stood in silhouette, its weathered facade mottled with peeling paint and creeping ivy that strangled its wooden bones. The windows, dark and hollow, stared outward as if they had long since lost the will to see the living world. From the main road, the property seemed untouched for decades, yet the air carried the strange stillness of a place that was not merely abandoned, but actively watching. The townsfolk of Blackfield, Massachusetts, did not linger on the road at twilight, especially not in sight of the gates. Even the most hardened among them crossed the street or muttered a warding prayer under their breath. The Rowan estate, known formally as Rowan's Reach, had been empty for as long as anyone under 60 could remember its history, woven from threads of whispered rumor, hushed warnings, and the occasional grim fact recorded in yellowed newspaper clippings. Those who dared to speak of it at all did so reluctantly, their voices dropping as if the house might overhear. The name Rowan still carried the weight of something unfinished, as if a story had been left open-ended for decades, and in that absence of resolution, dread had taken root. The Ghastly Journal, known for peeling back the rotting curtains on the darkest corners of history, had always circled the Rowan case like a moth drawn to a cold flame. Tonight, the audience would be taken inside that legend not through tourist hearsay, but through decades of accounts, archival records, and testimonies from those still unwilling to have their names printed. The host's voice, calm but carrying a warning, set the tone. This is not merely a tale of disappearance. This is a lattice work of bizarre rites, quiet evils, and a bloodline steeped in shadows. The promise was simple and terrible. By the end of the story, you would know why even the crows seemed to avoid the town square when the Rowan name was spoken. The arrival of the Rowans and the first signs. In the autumn of 1887, a man named Elias Rowan arrived in Blackfield with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from generational wealth. His fortune, built in the booming textile industry of the Northeast, allowed him to purchase 50 acres of woodland on the town's outskirts, a stretch of land locals had long avoided for reasons never clearly articulated. Within 2 years, a sprawling Victorian mansion had risen from the soil, complete with ornate gables, a wraparound porch, and a central tower that loomed like a sentinel over the countryside. Its presence altered the skyline, a fact some townspeople spoke of with pride, others with unease. Elias did not come alone. His wife Constance was a striking woman whose beauty was tempered by an air of impenetrable reserve. Town records, neat but perfunctory, describe her as a quiet presence, more observed than heard. Alongside them came 3 children, identical twin boys Edward and Edmund, and a daughter, Eleanor. In photographs from that first year, they appeared the perfect late 19th century family, well-dressed, poised, their expressions unreadable. The first fracture in that idyllic image came in the winter of 1890. A local hunter tracking game deep into the Rowan property stumbled upon a circle of stones arranged with uncanny precision. At its center lay a shallow pit filled with animal bones and black feathers. When questioned, Elias dismissed it as a Native American relic site. He wished to preserve a statement polite enough to disarm most curiosity. But not all were convinced. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, the parish priest, recorded in his private journal that he harbored grave concerns about the Rowan's spiritual state. His unease, written in cramped script, would not be read until nearly a century later. odd behaviors, and a community held at arm's length. Though the Rowans dutifully attended Sunday services, their presence was marked by small details that accumulated like dust on a forgotten shelf. Constance, for instance, was observed muttering words that were not part of any Christian liturgy during communion, her lips shaping syllables that drew no recognition from those nearby. Eleanor, still a child, displayed an unusually sophisticated knowledge of herbs, and their uses and expertise that seemed to surpass even the town's apothecary. The twins, identical in form but opposite in temperament, fascinated and unsettled their peers. Edward was charming, quick with a smile and a story, while Edmund watched people with a gaze so fixed and deliberate that adults often shifted uncomfortably under it. Despite these peculiarities, the family's importance to Blackfield was cemented by the textile mill Elias founded soon after settling. The mill provided steady work in a region that valued such stability, and so while conversations about the Rowans carried an undercurrent of suspicion, no one was willing to jeopardize the economic lifeline they represented. Rowan's Reach thus became a place that was both integral to the town's survival and entirely apart from it, a grand house on a hill whose windows never seemed to glow with the warmth of everyday life, but whose shadow reached deep into the streets below. It was this strange duality, prosperity tethered to quiet unease, that formed the bedrock of the Rowan legend. And as later events would prove, the most unsettling truths often begin as small, unremarkable deviations from the ordinary. The death of Constance and the arrival of Cordelia. In the spring of 1907, tragedy arrived at Rowan's Reach, draped in a veil of mystery. Constance Rowan was found lifeless in the estate's sprawling garden, her body positioned in a way that defied the casual narrative of heart failure given by the town coroner. Witnesses, few though they were, spoke in hushed tones of how her arms had been arranged above her head, her body at the precise center of an oval of freshly turned earth, crow feathers scattered so thickly around her that it seemed she had been nested there. The coroner's report was brisk, perhaps deliberately so, avoiding mention of the arrangement or the strange absence of disturbance in the surrounding soil. Officially, her death was natural. Unofficially, it was an echo of the stone circle discovered years before. The funeral was conducted at the town church, a modest affair considering the family's wealth. Constance was buried in the Rowan plot, a slab of unadorned granite marking her place among those who had gone before. Yet in the months following her burial, Elias's grief took a direction that would alter the course of the Rowan story entirely. Within half a year, Elias Rowan remarried. His new bride, Cordelia Winthrop, arrived without lineage or background to speak of appearing in Blackfield, as if she had stepped from the fog itself. She had no family listed in any census, no known friends from elsewhere, and took a room at the local boarding house just 2 weeks before meeting Elias at a charity event. Town gossip painted her as striking in an unsettling way, with eyes that seemed to linger too long on those she spoke to. Cordelia's arrival shifted the household's atmosphere in ways both subtle and overt. Servants whispered that the air in certain corridors felt heavier, that locked doors were sometimes found ajar, and that Cordelia had a habit of walking the grounds alone at night, collecting plants whose uses they did not know. Soon after her arrival, the quiet pulse of the town began to change. Reports of missing young women, mostly drifters or those without close families, surfaced more frequently. The authorities never drew a connection between these disappearances and Rowan's Reach, but the timing was too precise for some to ignore. Historian Margaret Simmons decades later would trace these vanishings on a map and note a chilling pattern. Every one of them fell within a day's ride of the estate. The bizarre death of Elias and the passing of the torch. 5 years after Cordelia entered the family, another death struck one even more baffling than Constance's. In 1912, Elias Rowan was found seated at his desk in the study, as though caught mid-thought while working. The cause of death, according to the coroner, was severe blood loss. Yet there was no blood anywhere in the room, none on the carpet, none on his clothes, none to suggest where it had gone. Even more disturbing, Elias's eyes had been removed with what the medical examiner described as surgical precision, and the sockets were perfectly clean. The official explanation, implausible as it sounded, attributed the murder to unknown enemies from Elias's business dealings. No arrests were made. The case went cold with the quiet efficiency of a town that preferred to avoid what it could not understand. In the wake of his death, leadership of both the estate and the textile business passed to Edward, the more socially adept of the Rowan twins. Edmund remained at the house, increasingly reclusive, rarely seen beyond the grounds. Cordelia, still very much the lady of the house, slipped seamlessly into her role as the family's matriarchal presence. Eleanor, returning briefly from Europe for her father's funeral, stayed only long enough to pay her respects, before leaving again, confiding to a childhood acquaintance that she couldn't breathe in that house anymore. It was a sentiment the townspeople understood without needing further explanation. The Rowan name remained powerful in Blackfield, but now the man who had founded their local dynasty was gone. What remained was a family that seemed both essential to the town's economic stability and increasingly untethered from its moral compass. Prosperity masking the uncanny. 1912 to 1930. The years following Elias's death were marked by paradox. Under Edward's careful management, the Rowan textile business thrived despite the economic turbulence brought by World War I and its aftermath. In 1920, Edward married Lillian Barnes, a well-regarded woman from Boston society whose presence added a sheen of respectability to the family. Together they had 2 children, Elias II, born in 1921, and Constance II, born in 1923 and named after Edward's late mother. Edmund, by contrast, withdrew further into the tower room of Rowan's Reach, a space that became the subject of countless rumors among mill workers. Strange sounds, low chanting in an unfamiliar tongue, the rhythmic tapping of wood or stone, and on some nights the rapid flutter of wings was said to emanate from the high windows after midnight. No one outside the household ever confirmed entering that room, and Edmund himself was rarely glimpsed outside its confines. Cordelia, now in her 40s, had grown eccentric in ways that disturbed even those tolerant of the family's oddities. She took to wandering the grounds barefoot in the moonlight, speaking in low tones to unseen companions. In 1925, she initiated what became an annual tradition, an elaborate masquerade ball held on the winter solstice. Guests were drawn by curiosity as much as by the promise of opulence, but many left unsettled. The masks worn by the Rowans themselves were unlike anything in polite society, crafted from actual bird skulls and feathers with glass eyes that seemed to follow guests as they moved through the candlelit rooms. One attendee, writing to a friend afterward, vowed never to return. The house is grand, the company refined, but the eyes of those masks, I swear they were not made by human hands. By 1930, the Rowan fortune appeared unshakable, yet a tension lingered beneath the polished surface. Whispers of strange practices and unwholesome gatherings persisted, tolerated only because the family's wealth kept the town afloat. It was, in retrospect, a fragile equilibrium, one destined to shatter. The disappearance of Edmund and the rise of the Crows. By the mid-1930s, Edmund Rowan was little more than a shadow in the family story, a figure whispered about, but rarely seen. His retreat into the central tower had become so complete that even household staff reported going months without laying eyes on him. When he did appear, it was often in the small hours of the night, walking the halls with a lantern, his bare feet silent on the wood floors. In the spring of 1935, Edward informed the town authorities that his brother had left for Europe to recover his health. The explanation was brief, the tone final. Yet no one ever saw Edmund depart, and no passenger manifest's passport records or letters from abroad bore his name. When pressed by curious townsfolk, Edward's charm faltered, replaced by a thin-lipped irritation. "It is a private family matter," he would say, ending the conversation. Around this same time, a new and unsettling phenomenon began to grip Blackfield. Crows, hundreds of them, appeared in numbers the town had never seen before. They congregated in the trees surrounding Rowan's Reach, blackening branches until they bent under the weight. Some days they swarmed so thickly overhead that the mid-afternoon sun dimmed to twilight. Farmers complained of fields stripped bare of seed, though the birds seemed less interested in food than in simply being there. Boston ornithologists summoned to investigate were baffled. "It's not migratory," one told the Blackfield Gazette. "They're not feeding, nesting, or breeding in normal patterns. It's almost as if they've chosen this place for reasons we can't explain." The experts left without answers, but the locals began to draw their own conclusions, most of them involving Edmund, who by then had been absent for months. The crows, some said, were his messengers. Others whispered that they were guardians, or perhaps vessels for something he had left behind. War and the fracturing of the Rowan line. The 1940s brought the world to war, and with it a new chapter for the Rowans. Elias II, Edward's only son, enlisted in the U.S. Army and was sent to Europe. Constance II. His younger sister remained at Rowan's Reach, spending her days in the shadow of her grandmother's name and her nights under Cordelia's increasingly watchful eye. By now, Cordelia, though not a Rowan by blood, had earned the moniker Old Lady Rowan among the townsfolk, as if time had passed over her without leaving a mark. In 1945, the telegram came: Elias II had been killed during the final push into Germany. Edward and Lillian were devastated, retreating from public life. But among the staff whispers circulated of a chilling moment overheard between Cordelia and Constance II. Now Cordelia allegedly told her, "The bloodline runs through you alone. The responsibility is yours." Responsibility for what no one dared ask. Edward's health declined rapidly in the years after his son's death. Doctors called it a wasting disease of unknown origin. By 1950, he was confined to his bed, tended by Lillian, while Cordelia assumed more authority over the estate's affairs. Constance II, now in her late 20s, had become an accomplished painter, though her subjects were almost exclusively crows. The paintings were unsettling birds rendered with human-like posture, their eyes too, knowing their wings spread in poses that seemed ritualistic. Visitors to her studio often left uneasy feeling as though they had been studied in return. This was the Rowan family the town knew as the Korean War began, diminished in number, guarded in presence, yet still wrapped in the same dark undercurrent that had haunted them for decades. Marriage, birth, and a tighter circle. In 1951, Constance II met Richard Hayes, a young doctor recently settled in Blackfield after serving as a military physician. Their courtship was brief and, according to local gossip, not entirely approved of by Cordelia. Nevertheless, the couple married in a small ceremony, held not at the town church, but at Rowan's Reach itself. The guest list was short family, a few close friends and several people from out of town whose connection to the bride or groom was never made clear. The following year, Constance gave birth to twin girls, Ililana and Cordelia Hayes. The delivery was not handled in a hospital, but at the estate overseen by Richard in his professional capacity, with Cordelia, now nearing 70 by the town's reckoning, present throughout. Neighbors noted that the family became even more reclusive after the twins' birth. The children were rarely seen in town, and when they were, it was only from a distance, bundled against the weather, even in mild seasons. Constance II's own public appearances dwindled to almost nothing. Friends who managed to visit described her as pale and distracted, often working on the paintings of birds in human settings. Crows seated at tables, crows standing in doorways, crows with faces that looked almost but not quite human. Edward's death in early 1953 left Lillian frail and ill, and she followed him to the grave just weeks later. For the first time in its history, Rowan's Reach was under the control of someone without the Rowan surname. Richard Hayes began discreetly inquiring about selling both the estate and the now struggling textile business. But before any sale could take place, the events of that summer would turn Rowan's Reach into the center of one of Massachusetts' most enduring mysteries. The Summer of Fire and Vanishing. 1953. On the morning of July 7, 1953, Blackfield awoke to a column of black smoke rising from the eastern outskirts. Rowan's Reach was burning. The fire, first spotted by a passing milk delivery driver, had already consumed the east wing by the time the volunteer fire department arrived. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning wood and something else. Something sharp and metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Inside the estate, chaos had unfolded with shocking speed. The blaze had begun in the east wing where the nursery was located. Firefighters pushing through the choking smoke discovered Richard Hayes's body in the hallway just outside the nursery door, his arms outstretched as if in one final attempt to reach the children. The cause of death was later determined to be smoke inhalation, but his positioning suggested he had collapsed mid-stride. The search of the rest of the house yielded something darker still. In the master bedroom, they found Constance II lying on her bed, her throat slashed deeply enough to leave no doubt it was murder. Forensic investigators working under primitive conditions compared to today concluded she had died before the fire began. The killer, they believed, had been someone she knew, someone in the house. And then came the most baffling detail of all. No trace of Cordelia Rowan or the twin girls was found. No remains, no clothing, no signs of escape. Given the intensity of the blaze in the nursery, investigators initially assumed they had perished and been consumed by the flames. But the fire chief, and a veteran of dozens of house fires, noted in his report that even in complete incineration, some physical evidence typically remains: bone fragments, metal from zippers or clasps, anything. Here there was nothing. The official conclusion was stark. Cordelia had killed Constance II, set the fire to destroy evidence, and fled with the twins. A manhunt spread across Massachusetts and into neighboring states, but no leads emerged. No witness came forward claiming to have seen them. It was as if after leaving the property line they had ceased to exist. The clearing in the woods and the old pattern resurfaces. The story might have ended as a simple, if grim, unsolved case, had it not been for what was found beyond the mansion's scorched remains. In the days following the fire, Blackfield police, aided by state troopers, combed the surrounding woods in search of any sign of the missing woman and children. The search dogs, reliable in countless prior cases, behaved in ways their handlers described as unnerving. They would follow a scent trail confidently until they reached the property's tree line, then stop abruptly, whining, circling, and refusing to proceed. It was as though the trail ended in mid-air. Former Police Chief Harold Bennett, then a junior officer, revealed decades later what was never entered into the official record. Deep in the woods, his search team stumbled upon a clearing. At its center lay a stone circle identical in design to the one reported back in 1890. This time, however, the shallow pit within was lined with crow feathers and something far more disturbing: bones. Human bones. Bones small enough to have belonged to infants. The discovery rattled even the most seasoned officers. Bennett recalled the captain ordering the site filled in immediately and warning the team never to speak of it. Said it would cause a panic, Bennett muttered in his old age. The command was obeyed, but word of the find leaked in whispers. From then on, the Rowan name was linked not only to disappearance and tragedy, but to something older, ritualistic, and perhaps far more deliberate. The failed demolitions and a reputation sealed. In the years after the fire, Rowan's Reach stood as a half-burned monument to its own history. The east wing was gone, but the rest of the house remained intact, looming over the grounds with an almost defiant presence. The county tried repeatedly to sell the property, once to a private buyer, twice to developers, but each attempt failed in ways that deepened the legend. In the late 1950s, a restoration crew contracted to repair the house abandoned the project after a series of equipment failures and unexplained accidents. A carpenter broke his wrist when his ladder, secured moments earlier, slid as if pushed. Another worker reported feeling a hand grip his shoulder, only to turn and find no one there. In 1968, a Boston developer bought the land with plans to raise the mansion and build a subdivision. On the morning demolition was to begin, the foreman arrived to find every piece of heavy machinery, bulldozers, cranes, a wrecking ball covered in crows. Hundreds of them sat in absolute silence, their black eyes glinting in the pale light. When the crew finally shooed them away and began work, the wrecking ball operator suffered a sudden heart attack mid-swing. His replacement refused to continue after claiming to have seen a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing in an upstairs window. The developer abandoned the project within weeks, citing structural issues in his official statement. Unofficially, he never set foot in Blackfield again. By the end of the 1960s, Rowan's Reach had passed fully into the realm of New England legend. It was no longer simply a burned-out mansion. It was an entity in the town's consciousness, a place where history and nightmare overlapped so tightly that no one could say where one ended and the other began. Rowan's Reach as a paranormal hotspot. The 1970s. By the 1970s, Rowan's Reach had become more than a local curiosity. It was a magnet for thrill seekers, amateur ghost hunters, and college students looking for a dare. Word had spread beyond Blackfield, passed along in campfire retellings whispered at roadside diners that the half-burned mansion could bend reality for those who crossed its threshold. Stories were dismissed by skeptics, but repeated often enough to take on a strange consistency. Visitors reported their watches stopping always at precisely 3:33 a.m., no matter the time zone or how recently the battery had been replaced. Cameras, whether cheap Polaroids or expensive SLRs, malfunctioned at the same spots in the house. The grand staircase, the landing outside the tower room, and the remains of the nursery in the east wing. Some developed photos revealed nothing unusual, but others contained faint shapes in the background, dark smudges in the outline of human figures, or more disturbingly crows, perched where no perches existed. Many who trespassed left the property feeling unsettled. A few, however, carried that unease into the days and weeks beyond. Accounts emerged of visitors being followed home by flocks of crows that lingered in their neighborhood sometimes for months. There were reports of accidents falling downstairs, car crashes, inexplicable injuries, often accompanied by sightings of a solitary crow watching from nearby. In 1975, a group of anthropology graduate students from Miskatonic University conducted an unauthorized overnight stay at the estate for a study on ritual architecture. Only 3 of the 5 returned. The 2 missing students were never found, despite extensive searches. Of the survivors, one withdrew from the university entirely. Another refused to speak publicly about the experience, and the 3rd years later died by suicide, leaving behind a note with just one line, "They're watching through the crow's eyes." Jessica Winter's investigation. 1983. In 1983, the Blackfield Gazette decided to mark the 30th anniversary of the 1953 fire with an in-depth feature. Reporter Jessica Winters, known for her persistence and skepticism, was assigned the story. She spent months combing through archives, interviewing elderly townsfolk, and tracking down anyone with a connection to the Rowan family. Her final article was unlike anything the paper had published before. Winter's piece proposed that the Rowan tragedies were not a series of unrelated misfortunes, but the deliberate fulfillment of a multi-generational ritual. She cited anonymous sources who claimed both Constance II and Cordelia were practitioners of a pre-Christian form of witchcraft, centered on transference, the shifting of human consciousness into avian vessels, particularly crows, according to her theory. The disappearances, strange deaths, and the constant presence of the birds were all parts of a long-standing plan culminating in the events of 1953. The article was met with outrage from some and fascination from others. The Gazette's editor publicly defended the piece as speculative journalism, but privately admitted to colleagues that they had never received so many letters in response to a single story. 2 weeks after publication, Winters was driving home when a swarm of crows flew directly into her windshield on a narrow bridge outside of town. Witnesses said the birds struck so suddenly and with such force that her car swerved through the guardrail into the river below. Divers searched for days, but neither her body nor her vehicle was recovered. Her final notes found in her desk ended mid-sentence. The ciphered journal of Edmund Rowan, 2008. The next major revelation came decades later in 2008. when the Blackfield Historical Society received a donation of papers from the family of a former Rowan mill worker. Among payroll ledgers and faded receipts was a leather-bound journal, its pages dense with strange symbols and angular script. The donor explained that the worker had found it hidden behind a false panel in the estate shortly before Edmund's disappearance in 1935, but had kept it secret for fear of what it might mean. Historians spent months attempting to decode the cipher, eventually translating portions that chilled even the most skeptical researchers. Edmund wrote of the covenant with those who watch from above, and a prophecy that the seventh generation shall complete the transformation. He referred repeatedly to something he called the Black Pinnacle, described as both a place and a process where the vessels are prepared and the passing made permanent. More disturbingly, Edmund claimed that Cordelia is not what she appears, and that he had seen her change her face as easily as one changes a mask. He implied that she had been present in multiple generations, guiding each toward a shared purpose. Anatomical sketches compared human and avian structures marked with points labeled transfer and containment. The final entry, dated just days before Edmund's supposed trip abroad, read, "I cannot complete my transformation yet. The bloodline must continue to the seventh, but I have seen what awaits us, and it is glorious. Until then, I will watch and wait with the others." The Historical Society released a carefully worded summary of the journal's content, but withheld scans of the actual pages citing their fragile condition. Unofficially, some whispered that several pages had gone missing from the Society's archives soon after the journal was catalogued, and that the only camera in the room where they were stored malfunctioned the night of their disappearance. The final collapse of Rowan's Reach, 2015. By the mid-2010s, Rowan's Reach had decayed into a dangerous shell. The county finally deemed it a public safety hazard after a string of injuries to trespassers, broken ankles from rotted floorboards, deep cuts from rusted nails, one near-fatal fall through the collapsed roof of the East Wing. In 2015, officials approved its demolition, hoping to erase both a physical danger and a lingering blot on the town's identity. Demolition was scheduled for early August, but the night before work began a storm unlike any in recent memory, swept through Blackfield. Lightning struck the property repeatedly, each bolt finding the central tower with uncanny accuracy. Residents living within sight of the estate claimed the flashes illuminated shapes moving within the tower's high windows, shapes that could not have been people, not with the roof caved in and the floors long since rotted away. By morning, the central tower had collapsed in on itself, taking much of the remaining structure with it. Demolition crews were left with a pile of rubble rather than a standing house. During the cleanup, workers unearthed a sealed room in what had been the cellar beneath the tower. Inside, they found artifacts that deepened the Rowan legend. Bird cages of varying sizes, some large enough to hold a human, lined the walls. Books in brittle, crumbling covers bore writing in languages no linguist could confidently identify. And on a low table rested two neatly folded sets of child-sized clothing, the style matching the early 1950s. The most unsettling object was a large circular mirror framed in carved black wood, the design a tangle of intertwined crows. The glass was unusually dark, as though it absorbed light rather than reflected it. Several workers reported feeling dizzy or disoriented after looking into it. One claimed he saw his own reflection turn to face away from him. The mirror was sent to a university lab for analysis, but the delivery truck carrying it was found abandoned on a rural road. The driver was missing, the cargo bay empty except for a scattering of black feathers. The arrival and disappearance of Clara Bennett. 2019. In early 2018, the story took an unexpected turn when a woman named Clara Bennett appeared in Blackfield claiming to be a distant descendant of the Rowans through an undocumented branch of the family tree. She produced genealogical documents so meticulously preserved that experts remarked on their improbably pristine condition. Court records describe her as striking in appearance, though more than one official noted an unsettling quality. Her eyes seemed to hold an unnatural depth, almost as if they were too dark to catch the light. Her petition for ownership of the Rowan property was granted, and by spring 2019 she had announced plans to transform the site into a memorial garden honoring the legacy of her family. Construction began quietly, but within weeks it was halted. Workers digging the foundation for a central monument uncovered human remains, at least a dozen individuals, most of them female. Forensic analysis placed the dates of death as far back as the early 1900s, aligning disturbingly with the disappearances historian Margaret Simmons had linked to the estate decades earlier. The discovery launched a criminal investigation, but before authorities could question her further, Clara Bennett vanished. Her rented home was left completely empty with no sign she had ever lived there. The lease had been paid in cash. The identification she had provided was revealed to be a flawless forgery. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed her walking away from the property on the night she disappeared, but in every frame her face was obscured by a strange visual distortion, an unfixable glitch that technicians could not explain. The Unchanging Twin Girls and the Crows, 2020 onward. In 2020, a new wave of reports swept through Blackfield. Multiple unrelated witnesses claimed to have seen twin girls no more than 6 years old at the edges of the woods surrounding the former Rowan property. Their descriptions were uncannily consistent. The girls wore matching old-fashioned dresses. Their hair was dark and perfectly parted. Their eyes were darker still, so dark that no whites could be seen. The girls were always silent, standing motionless as if waiting for something. Witnesses often noticed crows nearby, sometimes dozens forming loose rings around the children. If approached, the twins would retreat into the woods with preternatural grace, their movements neither hurried nor afraid. Within moments, they would vanish among the trees, leaving no footprints behind. Local ornithologist Dr. James Ferris began studying the crows that seemed to follow certain townspeople, especially those who had spoken publicly about the Rowan case or visited the property. He documented instances of the birds gathering in deliberate formations visible only from above. In one recorded event, the crows arranged themselves into the shape of two small human figures, holding the formation for nearly 20 minutes before dispersing. This is not normal flocking behavior, Ferris stated. It's deliberate, coordinated, and I don't know what it means. Authorities dismissed the sightings as urban legend fueled by the town's history, but child psychologist Dr. Elena Rodriguez interviewed several witnesses and noted their accounts were too precise to be coincidence. These people did not know each other, she said, yet they all described the same details, not just the girl's appearance, but the stillness, the way they seemed to communicate without speaking, and the bird's protective presence. To the people of Blackfield, one fact became certain: whatever had happened at Rowan's Reach in 1953, it had not ended there. Reluctance in uniform. The police and the property. By early 2023, the official investigation into the remains found in 2019 had slowed to a near standstill. The Blackfield Police Department's public statements were brief, formulaic, and carefully worded. "We continue to investigate the human remains found on the property." At this time, there is no evidence directly linking these findings to the events of 1953 or the disappearance of Clara Bennett. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was different. Officers spoke in lowered voices, their reluctance to patrol the area palpable. One officer, speaking anonymously, described how patrol assignments near the former Rowan property were decided by drawing straws. "Nobody wants it," he admitted. "Not because we think we'll run into a killer, but because of the feeling. You step onto that land and it's like something's behind you the whole time. Your skin just knows it." Others mentioned the persistent technical failures, radios turning to static body cams going dark without reason, and sometimes, most disturbingly, catching faint, childlike whispers just beneath the static's hiss. No words could be made out, but the voices were always there, pressing at the edge of comprehension. The property itself was still cordoned off with faded yellow crime scene tape, though the elements had frayed it to tatters. In the absence of constant police presence, locals avoided the site more out of superstition than respect for the law. Teenagers dared one another to run the fence line at night, but few made it far. Even those who laughed off the legend often admitted later and quietly that they had felt watched from the tree line. By now, the connection between the twin girls and the Rowan legacy had become an open secret in town. The sightings, the crows, the feeling of being surveilled, it all fit too neatly into a pattern Blackfield had been trying to ignore for 70 years. Yet the absence of proof kept the story in the liminal space between urban legend and open secret, exactly where it had always thrived. The historian's last words. An ending that refuses to end. If one person could be called the steward of the Rowan story, it was historian Margaret Simmons. For over 6 decades, she had dedicated herself to assembling the puzzle, poring over dusty archives, cross-referencing missing persons cases, and tracing the web of oral accounts that wove the Rowan name into the fabric of Blackfield's darkest history. When I spoke with her, she was 84, still sharp-eyed and careful with her words. She refused to speculate on the supernatural elements, stating simply, "I deal in documented facts." But when I pressed her on whether she thought the Rowans had truly believed in their rituals, she paused for a long time. Outside her window, a murder of crows, the same group she claimed had been visiting her lawn for decades, shifted restlessly in the grass. "Belief," she said at last, "has power, whether or not it's rooted in reality." And I think they believed. Then, with the faintest hint of unease, she added, "In all my years researching this case, I've never once seen a photograph of Cordelia Rowan where her eyes weren't obscured by shadow, by the camera angle, by something. And as for the twins, many have seen them, I never have. Sometimes I wonder if that's because they're waiting for me to finish telling their story. And I wonder what will happen when I do." 2 weeks after our conversation, Margaret Simmons died quietly in her sleep at the age of 94. Her caregiver noted one strange detail the morning of her death. The crows that had been a constant presence around her home for years were gone. They have not returned. The site of Rowan's Reach remains empty, the ground reclaimed by weeds and wind. But the legend is not gone. People still report seeing the twin girls at the edge of the woods, silent and watchful crows wheeling above them in slow circles. If you hear tapping at your window at night, the locals will tell you not to look. And if you do look and see two small figures in the fading light, turn away. Do not speak their names. Do not follow them into the trees, for in Blackfield some histories are never laid to rest. They wait patient as the crows for the moment when someone is careless enough to let them in again.